racked by guilt because they've been treating you worse than they feel like they should have and never really got around to making it up or apologizing. In fact, someone who's guilty, you can typically ask to do favors for you. It's a tradable resource. Hey, I'm Demon Dev, and I'm working on Double Demons, a VR dating sim with magic combat, with an entirely revolutionary way of doing dialogue choices as a core mechanic. Half the world is dying from supernatural depression, and the only way to fix it is to kill monsters and develop relationships. And I'm starting to feel like I may actually be stumbling onto creating a new genre within video games, but I will let you be the judge of that as I make my way through Ideas Guy explaining. Basically, I've been working on the game for 6 years, yeah, and I've gone through a lot with the project, but I'm mostly just really excited to share some of my ideas and how I answer everything that's going on within dialogue choice. So I'm gonna go ahead and dive into it. I'm gonna go all the way from the beginning. So I apologize if you've heard me talk about dialogue choice boxes and branching structures in the past, because we're definitely going to hit that again today. So games have existed for a long time with dialogue choices, especially story heavy ones or ones kind of exploring experimental mechanics there. Typically you have dialogue options A, B, C. Let's say this is like diplomatic negotiations, one guy versus another. One option could be fight. Another option could be allies. Another could be something more neutral, stay neutral. And now this is pretty cool, and I've always loved games that do dialogue choices. Over time, it's become a bit sour for me in some ways that I'll dig into how I'm trying to do things in a different way. But it's really cool. I remember playing like Stronghold 2 and many games where you did have significant branching, fighting, especially like, if you're thinking about like a medieval RTS game like that was, leads you in a completely different campaign than being allies or neutral. Now you might play some of the same missions, but you might, start in a different place in the map, or, even if you're at the same place, blah, 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 blah. Doesn't matter. Anyways, I would call this traditional branching, which is basically you give the player a dialogue choice or, some sort of, very straightforward choice, and it has a very straightforward outcome. Great. There's a few problems with this. One is there's really no way to communicate to players how to get good at choices. A lot of times they're sort of story outcome based, so arbitrarily one choice is like the right choice, or depending on which ending you want, or like what you want to have happen to your character at the end of a cutscene. Some choices, and this is kind of where the writers come in, or the developers, some choices are just better, or the only right choice sometimes for getting to the happy ending. So maybe in this case, your main hero character not being assassinated. But I always wanted there to be some sort of a way where not only were the dialogue choices more consistent, or just like choices in general, you could have more freedom, but it was like a trainable skill. So I quickly became really invested in trying to work on a dating sim project, which is what Double Demons is, primarily, where you have many different characters, and you can essentially pursue any of them and try to make it work. And I always thought that was a really fun concept. And there's definitely plenty of games out there that have romance mechanics or dating sims. The problem is that, again, we run into the same thing where there's the right answer if you want a specific outcome. and you may be saying, okay, what's wrong with the right answer? If you're playing a first-person shooter, there's right answer too. You want to shoot the enemy, and if you don't shoot them, you lose, or they shoot you first. But actually, it's not true. I would say first-person shooters on a mechanical level, as far as what the player can do or is capable of, within first-person shooters, you have many different options that can all be a valid path to victory, though, maybe not optimized or maybe requiring some pretty crazy stuff. So, for example, in first-person shooters like Call of Duty or Halo, there's usually like a melee weapon, which, bringing a knife to a gunfight, not the smartest idea, but it's extremely fun if you do get behind someone or they miss their bullets or they're reloading and you just walk up to them and kill them. A super fun way to get to the victory. And you can start to see, okay, victory is a bigger concept. It's not just, universal happy ending kind of story. It's, well, basically they died or you didn't die or some combination of objectives. There's many ways to feel that. Just like, you can get the standard assault rifle and get the same victory. And maybe some people enjoy that more, where you just kind of hold down the button and you'll get a lot more kills usually, given the same kind of experience or skill level than you will get with the like melee knife fights kind of strategy. But you get the idea. There's multiple ways to experience not just the game, because even, games that are writing based or dialogue choice, there are multiple ways to, you can be mean or you can be flirty, depending on the game. So there are multiple ways to do that. But if you want it to end in a relationship working, or even just, not all games end up with characters ending up together, but from whatever is possible, then only one of those options is going to work. Whereas, again, with first-person shooters, you can do multiple. And this is, I would say, across the board, from MOBAs to rogue likes to MMOs. They all, have a way more open-ended sense of, goals or victory. And I think there's a lot of merit to saying that there is story, in your kind of experience and how you get to, those objectives. So, how do we bring this to dialogue choice, and why do I argue it's not there? So I already went over that, as long as you tie my rendition of a broken heart, as long as you tie dialogue choices to always be linked to an outcome, you don't get any of the micro, like, nuanced play of skill or timing. What you're up against, if it's multiplayer, some people are really not expecting you to go knife mode and sneaking around the map, and some people are. So what that would be similar to is if, you're being mean in this kind of approach, it would be more like you have a couple different types of being mean, mean in an overt way, or a sneaky way, or in a gaslighty way. Always fun. So when you have those different versions, and I would compare those to being, like the knife, sniper, and then assault rifle. So when you have multiple ways that are very similar in achieving the same outcome, then you have to enter into some sort of rule-based system. Give me back my color. You have to enter into some sort of rules-based system in order to the game judges what the outcome is. So traditionally, dialogue choices are more or less linked to the outcome, but in this, we're grouping them together in some ways where there's a sub-choice. So it's not just, being mean or nice, and within the context, that would probably, be like an insult or a compliment. The kind of bigger overarching ideas, almost like if a first-person shooter game gave you the option of both, shooting your opponent or healing them, that kind of idea. And then some sort of system needs to occur in order to arrive at different outcomes, and not just tied, okay, this one will always be bad and this one will always be good, but actually based on some sort of unique properties or variables, it will assess those, and you can actually get to both. Not always, but sometimes from multiple. And then that opens up the whole kind of skill or mastery, then becomes judging what variables do you care about for other purposes in order for it to all line up for specific moments. So for example, within a dating sim, that might be asking a girl out. In order for her to say yes, it's got to meet some kind of criteria. And this is what I've settled on, but to simplify things, let's say that there's a keyframe at an 8 out of 10. And if you get to 8 out of 10, then essentially the AI will say yes to you asking her out, and anything below that, she'll say no. So how do we then introduce all the different choices? Well, basically, let's just take the entire idea of asking someone out. You can do it in a direct way, which would be like, do you want to go out with me? Bold, risky. Do you go with me? Food. And then I do this with depth, and I'll get to depth branching later. But with depth just means that they're all grouped together. And the grouping is really important. It's a bit of a hard concept to understand why, but when you group all of the dialogue choices that share the same meaning, so this is all asking her out or him, lots of choices. When you group them all together, then you can also group together all of the replies. So because the meaning is the same, it should be possible for the AI to react to any of those with their full set. So if this bar represents the AI feeling like awful or like terrible, she hates whatever you're doing, and a 10 is she loves it, then that means that she will take into account how you're saying it, so the direct or more subtle or manipulative. So she'll take those into account, but it'll enter onto the same spectrum. So maybe sometimes when you're direct, she'll say yes, but however you get to this point may require variables that are already really high. So perhaps being direct gives you a small bump. Maybe being subtle or manipulative actually gives you a bigger bump, which would also mean that you could have maybe a much lower relationship value and then still get to that yes point. And basically what this does is just kind of opens up the playing field, that there's multiple ways to get to those end states. And it's not even at that point that the end state is the same. In fact, yes does not compress all of the states to that. Just like if you kill someone with a knife, a lot of people will enjoy that a lot more in a first-person shooter. A lot of people enjoy that a lot more than using assault rifle. It just feels very skillful and like you have good timing and you've really outsmarted or gotten the quick over the other players. So what's next? So that anyways, that means that the experience is different. So maybe being direct, especially for as kind of emotionally involved as this game is going to be, being direct is probably the only way to ask them out, at least on your first playthrough, that will feel, the maximum amount of comfortable or happy or like you're actually having chemistry with a character, in which case you are then presented with a complicated decision to make. But you can start to see how this is working. So you might be wondering, what is the difference between A, B, and C? And supposedly, I'll go with 1, 2, 3. Well, at first, not a huge difference other than the grouping, right? So the group of depth branching must always have the possibility to be linked to the same set. So if you ask a girl out and you have 3 ways of saying it, all of those 3 ways will be connected to the AI's thought process in saying yes, maybe, or no. And that is the big difference, whereas traditional branching has traditional outcomes. Now, yes, technically, I shouldn't say technically. Yes, a lot of them use more complicated variables than just direct assignment. But it still comes down to a very similar thing where there's a right answer and there's not like a set of acceptable answers within a range usually. Especially not when it comes up onto the moment. And definitely something that I feel like is underexplored is the means by which you cross that threshold. So theoretically, a traditional game could stack all of these so that they end up going to the same place. One of the problems is that I'll just call it legacy. Traditional or legacy dialogue choices don't enforce a consistent rule system at all. So it could be that they're all linked to the same spectrum, and maybe a lot of games have a relationship value that either gatekeeps accessing the content, like asking them out on a date or the actual date or just spending time with them, or it determines the outcome. So the relationship bar must already be filled up, and then the appropriate options will have the result. Most don't do it this way, but some do. Super fun. Now the cool thing when you group it in this way is you actually can have a variant outcome. So yes, yes to what? Is it yes to being direct, yes to being subtle, or yes to being manipulative? And not only is this a compressed state, so you could think of it on a 0 to 10 spectrum of, a range. Think of it as their keyframes, actually. That'll be a little bit less confusing. 2, 5, and 8. So normally, in most games, you would, once you get to this kind of end cutscene or end state or just relationship status, maybe you're going out, you would think that it would be kind of all compressed. So how close you were, the way that you talk to them throughout the entire game, you could think of this as a lot of games have relationship variables with these sorts of stuff. So where this comes into play could determine, where you fall within this range, all acceptable ranges to end up with that character. You must have a relationship or the relationship bar between 10 and 6. And then depending on how far away, you have an even greater range. So maybe you can get it with a 5 if you select the right option. And by right, I just mean like most heavily influencing. So if you choose a manipulative option, maybe you can get them to say yes, even if the relationship bar is only at a 5. But even then, it's not the same as, this is getting very gross. So I'm just going to put it side by side. Let's say on one run, you're at a 5 out of 10 relationship. You use manipulation and asking them out, and maybe you've acquired the appropriate skills, or it plays on strengths or weaknesses in different ways, and that gets you just barely to where you need to be in order for them to say, okay, yeah, I'll grab the popcorn and we'll go to the movies. Great. But that's not the same as being at an 8. And getting them to go out, because it also represents not just the way that you said it. So if you're at an 8, you have the freedom, assuming you care about them saying yes, you have the freedom of being direct. So you don't have that weighing on you. And then additionally, the difference between how they feel and what they end up reacting with is also tracked. So anyways, there's a lot more to it, but the general idea is that when you group things together in this way, when you give the player options that are not just A, B, C, but A, 1, 2, 3, and this is where we get into the kind of macro-micro choices. But if you nest certain dialogue options or any options for a game within a bigger category, then you can compare all the different properties, just kind of like Pokemon damage, fire, water, ice. You can compare the different damage types within the context of that specific interaction. So some Pokemon or AIs like, hate, and find confusing. Definitely mixing metaphors with Pokemon and Devil Demons, but you get the idea. Different types of attacks have strengths or weaknesses with different people, different Pokemon that you're fighting. Same way with AIs. Some guys in the game will really like it when you're more confrontational. Some guys will appreciate more sensitivity. That's case by case. There are a couple rules that I have kind of universal across the game to make it a little less unbelievable and more natural. It's primarily inspired by what I think is true about real life, but I also I do like to lean into it being fun and expanded, not just what's purely realistic, but also given a premise that's interesting that could exist in real life, what does a player do with that? So at a baseline 1, 2, 3 in my system would all be variants of one choice actually that's confusing, in one choice of how traditionally dialogue branches has been working. Now I've given myself a lot of credit already, and some of you who are more deep into this stuff may be wondering, let's say that the circle equals a player dialogue choice. You may be thinking, okay, that's interesting that you can compare the choice, like within multiple choices. So it wouldn't just be A 1 2 3, but B 1 2 3. And you could think of this as like, this is all asking them out, and this could be all just insulting them, or something casual like see you tomorrow. Totally different meanings, but because internal, like 1 2 3, within these all share the same core meaning, that means the AI can have one or many ways of reacting to it. So there could be a sneaky way to be insulting where you're like, oh, this is not so bad for your first time, where it's like, it's kind of a compliment, but also can be taken in complicated ways. Or a more bold insult, which might be like, not everyone gets it on their first try, or, I'm sure if you practice a lot, you'll, be happy with the results. Would be a much meaner variant of that. Maybe ridiculously slow to the point of it justifying a completely different set. One of the cool things is this kind of verifies itself. So you write, what the dialogue option would be, and then you write what the AI's response could be. And then as you add different ways to express that same idea, if that idea can be reacted to by that AI naturally, then great. And if it can't, then you have to change those dialogue options. Instead of adding another expression, in some cases, you can only make an insult in, so much of a way before it's not really an insult anymore, at which point, instead of it being another kind of sub-expression, so a micro is the way you express something, and the macro is the meaning of that expression. Oops. And most specifically, the macro, you could think of it as an intersection point. If I can hit the target, you could think of it as an intersection point across all the different expressions. So one of the complicated things with a lot of dialogue choices in games is they're not easy to read out what it means, especially within the context of games and cinematic cutscenes that could go in very surprising ways, and not always satisfyingly surprisingly, but sometimes just like, that was dumb. So we have that issue with dialogue choices where it's like, man, what does that mean? But we have the opposite problem as well. And maybe a good example of vague is like it gets cut off and you don't even see all of what you're saying. But even if you do, see the entire thing of all your options, well, that's really slow and also not natural. Part of what makes conversation, especially in high stakes environments, and I would say definitely dating or, romance conflict, would be something like that. Part of what makes it fun is, there's all these, things going on. I don't know why I have like clouds. It just kind of looks like popcorn, I guess. But you have all these things going on in the background. Like, do they know that I like them? Are my friends snitching on me? Are they acting strange? Are they, doing hints? There's all this stuff going on. So you almost, like, if you're writing these types of scenes, and obviously exists outside of romance as well, but if you're writing these scenes, you can't include all the words that would make it clear to the poor player. VR game, yeah. You can't make it clear because that takes all of the magic out of it. And also you start to not feel like it's you deciding if it's so well laid out that, like, you're just playing off a script. But if it's vague, that's can be really frustrating because you have projected yourself on what you want or what you think the dialogue choice means, and you can very often be wrong, or the choice can not matter at all, is common as well. So the really cool thing about structuring dialogue choices, not in a, I would say, traditionally we have done dialogue choices in kind of a chaotic mess. So there's been no rhyme or reason, even when we have given them categories, like with Mass Effect, or many different kind of detective games, you have emotional categories, and you would say, okay, is that the same as this? Well, no, because there's no universal rule set that they exist within. When you see, aggressive, conciliatory, or evasive, these are not the system that I've described, where they are all, share the same meaning. So this could be like defensive maneuver could be the macro that they all share. But that's part of the problem, is in practice, most of the time, if there's any branching at all, these would not be sharing a macro. They would, in many cases, it's like disjointed in a very unclear way. So conciliatory and aggro could end up leading to the same thing, where being aggressive and trying to resolve things ignites the enemy to, time to duel. So you could easily do that. And evasive may be the only way to get a clean, like I think of Deus Ex and trying to sneak into the police building. And there was a very long chain of dialogue. And sometimes there'll be sort of like a taunting effect, where it feels like a repetitive dialogue choice or category of dialogue choice is being offered. You get desensitized, and you just kind of are like, all right, let's go. And then like, oops, one of those dialogue choices mattered. And they're, the specific thing I'm remembering is some like, like, hey, let me go check out the coronary, like the autopsy or something. And they're like, oh, I shouldn't let you, and I'm mad at you. And it was going on and on and on. And then there was like a line that was like, oh, let's just bury the hatchet. And then he like loses it. And he's like, oh, we can't bury the hatchet. There's like a dead kid or something. I can't remember exactly, but I remember being very frustrated because I felt like I was playing it really well. And not that playing the conversation dialogue choices really well means you deserve to, continue and feel like you're the best. But like, I just didn't understand what I was supposed to be, I guess, intuiting, using my intuition to understand was the right or wrong choice. It just kind of felt arbitrary. And that's what this structure is. If you don't declare or have consistency, what are micro and what are macro choices? And this is a concept that basically I've invented in this context. Then there's not enough consistency for the players to pay attention, let alone strategize. So one way that this could work is if they're all sharing the same macro, then that you can purely focus on the emotional sub-options. So when the macro is shared, let me make this bigger. When the macro is shared, you don't know much other than that any of these three options will share the same spectrum of reactions. So you can relax a little bit as far as like big scale branching. Now, it could still branch in a significant way. So, if you're in a life or death situation, the difference between being sassy and being apologetic, it wouldn't, in this case, if that was set up that way, maybe the macro that's shared is you're begging for your life. And the sassy version of that is like, you wouldn't want to kill me. It's like a waste of your time. um, or like, you're really gonna waste your time. I thought you were higher ranked than that, something like that. And then an apologetic version of begging for your life is like, I messed up. You don't need to. I've learned my lesson. I'm not sure, but anyways, you would know that they all branch to the same thing. In this case, the AI isn't really taking like the big meaning difference, because they're kind of all the same idea. They're all share the idea that you're begging for your life. The AI in this case, maybe he is, deciding whether to kill you. Oops, that would probably be on the lower end of the spectrum, usually, not always. That's up to the writer. To kill you, to barter, I guess, or to, let you flee. So because this system is universal and it will always work this way, maybe there's other macros where instead of begging for your life, you're demanding a duel. Perhaps that would count as a completely separate, where they're less thinking about kill, barter, flee, and they're thinking more about sizing you up, like, whether they think they're afraid, or if they think they can take you. And maybe they would be flopped. Depends what you want to do. But yeah, having a consistent universal rule and how dialogue choices like matter in the game is really important. I mean, it would be like in a first-person shooter, if just like sometimes your bullets did no damage. Like, no, I'm not talking about like missing. Like, you hit them and they just do no damage randomly sometimes. Except in some ways it's a little bit worse than random, because it's kind of at the convenience or lack of time and development to support that. So it would oftentimes be at a momentous place. So in a first-person shooter, that would be like, you're having your one-on-one duel in a death match with the last person, and then your bullets just aren't working. And then you learn in the post-game screen, perhaps, that the game had pre-decided you were always going to lose that fight. Or maybe you could have won that fight if you had made other decisions earlier, but you probably weren't told, or if so, it was a very vague thing, at which point, like, okay, are you going to replay a bunch of stuff? Doesn't feel great either. Tricky problems to solve. But when you have it in this open-ended system, then players can elevate like one meta level greater. You're no longer thinking, is this another dumb choice I want to skip through? You're saying like, oh, there's a macro decision here. I better look at these real quick to make sure that we're not going off on two very separate branches, one of these is stealing from them, and the other is, grabbing them food. But if there's only one macro, and then all you're choosing is your expression within that, if you're, for some reason, forcibly stealing from someone, finding the impulse irresistible, then you're not thinking about like, oh, does the game want me to steal or not steal? You're like, okay, stealing is the only option, and within that, how do I want to go about it? It allows the player to focus and zoom out more. Anyways, I'm really excited about that. I could go on and on about that, and probably have and will again. So okay, we've got the macro, the micro. Great. Now I'm not done yet, and this is as I start to exit, pure, small spin on a genre and more transformative work, where basically, do I enjoy playing this game now that I've changed so much? So for a long time, I was trying to figure out, well, how do you visualize all these options? If I'm doing, this is an entire macro, all of these are stealing. And within that, every expression of stealing is, maybe a more cocky way, or like a direct confrontation. Sneaky, of course, a great way to steal. And maybe even like there's like a flirty way where you're using some sort of charisma or something like that to give yourself a bigger window to steal without being noticed. So that's the macro, and all of these are micros. Great. But the problem is that's a lot of options to sort through. Now, I did do an emotion dictionary, which is basically just I made a spectrum of what I felt like were a good subset of emotions. So mean to friendly, serious to funny, timid to confident. What else? Crude to clean, dumb to smart. That's a classic. And cliche to unique. So this is what I came up with. And for the most part, especially within conversation, most things you say actually have 2 damage types. So that's pretty similar to Pokemon as well. You have a primary. Well, mine, they have a primary. I don't know if they necessarily have or double the damage in this way in Pokemon. But you have your types, so it could be mean and timid. And that, through the emotion dictionary, would just present to the player as passive aggressive. So another one of those words would be cocky. Maybe cocky would be a combination of confident and crude. Direct might be serious and confident, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you can get a pretty fast gist as far as damage type goes from those quick words. So I compressed it some, but it starts to fall out the window when you start having multiple macros. Because, okay, so for one macro, I have it capped out at 6 maximum options. So that would be like a moment where you're choosing your words extremely carefully to be essentially for the player as if you were considering saying the same thing 6 different ways. That's pretty nuts. But the whole point is that I don't want to turn off the power of traditional branching. Like, I still want big differences in your choices to matter. So I do allow and encourage multiple macros. So up to 6 by 6 options. I think in practice, you're probably going to have like a total of like 6 to 9 options at a point. But in order to kind of future-proof and stress test the system, it is possible to have up to 36 dialog options that are all like pre-written but are summarized based on their macro. And this is probably, I don't know, like 3 years into work on this project, that the overwhelmingness was not easy for me to ignore. Like, this is a lot of options in one moment. And the problem was getting worse, not better, because I realized that the grouping of macros, actually, let me keep macros being squares and micros being circles. The grouping of macros turned out to be more and more powerful the longer I worked with it. Oh yeah, sorry, let me keep that off my face. Basically, when you, as I've been explaining, when you group macros to their reaction sets for AIs or just whatever the effects of the actions are, you end up getting so many cool effects where you can compare all the different player choices to themselves and generate AI reaction content from that. So, for example, I realized, okay, if an AI has 3 written responses, let's focus on the keyframes for now. a 1, a 5, and a 9. I realized, oh, well, we can take the primary emotion of whatever the player said. So if the player is mean, and then we can use that. So if the player says something mean, regardless of what all the other options were, the AI will use that to generate their own internal emotional experience, which was really fun. So if the player is mean and the AI happens to choose a reaction that is a 1 out of 10, so terrible, then they're specifically reacting emotionally to the emotional component of what the player is saying, and that would be something like enraged. Now, again, based on different variables, your relationship could be anywhere starting on the 0 to 10, and I'll get into reaction formulas later. But you could be anywhere on the 0 to 10 to start out with. So maybe being mean, you have a really good relationship. So instead of you being all the way at like a 0 or a 1, the calculation of the AI, which just basically means how the AI feels about what you just said based on all your relationship history in the context of where you are right there, maybe ends up being a 5. So, maybe the reaction to you being mean is more milquetoast, grumpy or cold shoulder, that sort of thing. And basically, with the reaction dictionary, based on the unique choices the player makes, even if there's only one AI written response, maybe, and that's an important tool for the writer to have, not just infinite written options for the AIs to, meet unsustainable levels of detail, although sometimes warranted. Sometimes the writer's like, no, this character is never going to be okay with pineapple on pizza. I guess that would be a low score then. Yeah, this character, you cross the line. If you put the chunks on the cheese, they're gonna lose their shit. Yeah, but even then, it still matters. So I guess let's just apply this to this example. If you're mean, so this is like a dialogue choice that you're like, hey, let's get some pizza. Maybe there's some back and forth, and you're like, hey, I've had a tough week. Like, seriously, you're being an asshole right now if you don't get pineapple pizza. So I guess that would be a mean way to express your demand for pineapple pizza. Depending on your prior relationship, you still get different effects. So the AI's internal experience is going to be the same. So no matter what, if you're mean and the AI's chosen reaction is like a 1 out of 10, they're enraged. But that doesn't necessarily mean they express that enragement to the players. That's just the AI's internal experience. What actually happens in the game is this a secondary process. So maybe they're trying to hold that inside. They're very, very mad, but they're gonna be like, I'm not hungry. Do what you want. Or like, you pineapple pizza people are all the same. Even though the writer has only written one possible response in this situation for the character because of how important pineapple pizza hating is to them, where it comes from. So, based on relationship and the micro expression. So, the different things. But we're just going to stick with me now to simplify. Let's say your relationship, it could be really high. It could be, more in the middle range, or it could have already been low. So if the AI's emotional reaction as far as taking your relationship into account is here. So this, you think about that as like your true emotional self. Someone says something that pisses you off, your 0 to 10 rating is like how you're feeling. Fortunately or unfortunately, depends on how you feel about the philosophy of self-expression and all of that. For better or for worse, even when you have a pure reaction, you don't necessarily have the words to perfectly describe that, or want to, even if you are aware of the words. So typically, and I call this compression, if you're very interested in the subject, you should definitely watch my, I think emotion equals math plus compression or something like that. But definitely check that out if you're really into the weeds on this stuff for yourself or just out of interest. But basically, and this is, I think, very true to real life, we cannot perfectly express ourselves and often don't want to in practice. So usually if you have a 5 out of 10 reaction, totally milquetoast, you're going to either bump it up or bump it down. If someone's telling you about how much fun they had watching sports ball or football or whatever last weekend, maybe you have a totally neutral reaction, but maybe you don't enjoy expressing that neutral reaction. So you just kind of lean into either saying like, whoa, that's cool, even though you're not feeling it. And that would be basically a writer combining the AI, that character's emotional experience with the limitations or constraints of life for that character. So a good example of this would be, the nerd that gets bullied, or anyone who gets bullied. A lot of times they are suffering internally, and sometimes they're expressing that like, hey, knock it off. And other times they, bottle it up or hold it in because, well, many, many reasons, but that's just kind of one of the compressed options. In real life, you don't usually sift through, think of it as gradations, infinite sub choices of what you're going to say. You kind of have 1 or 2 or 3 things you're going to say, and then you're going to try to pick the best one based on your relationship and emotional influence. And then within that, you might be like, well, it's whatever they want to say. Well, no, because the character is summarized by the set of all these options. So there's a context, which is whatever dumb shit the player just said. So the AI character only exists within that context. So all of these 3 things are only things they would say. Let's just do that instead. So these are already perfectly matching the character. So then what do you have left? If you've already got all of the things that a character could say in that moment, the only thing that can change is the player or their relationship with the player in the past. So, we've systematized meaning, I think. And that's how it goes. And that'll choose what they say. And again, even if there's only one dialogue choice written or reaction for the AI to say, so not this, but this enraged pizza thing, the difference, the jump factor, or the snapping up or snapping down, is tracked as an additional variable. And this is, I think, very true to real life and solves a lot of problems with these sorts of systems, or this system that I've made, which for a long time I really didn't have an answer to, and that's frustration and guilt. So, and this also beautifully takes some of the burden off the writer, because something that I think I almost addressed but then didn't, but is a very serious concern or criticism of the Electra system at first glance is, wait, you're complaining about the exponential branching problem. Actually, I guess technically exponential branching is more like traditionally there's just one outcome, and sometimes they share the same one, but in order to keep it meaningful, each of these essentially equals another set of choices. Blah, blah, blah. And each of those branch. Anyways, you might be saying, Demon Dev, you haven't solved the problem of exponential content that writers have to make in order to make choices meaningful. You've actually made it worse because what you're saying is adding depth. So isn't what you're doing this? And then another set of these, and the counterpart would be another set of that. So many chat boxes. Right. So, did I make it worse? Well, yes. At first glance, very much yes. I took an exponential problem, and then instead of squared, it's now cubed. Instead of 2 choices, there's 2 choices plus depth. So that's a lot of total possible choices. But sneakily, and I think this actually ends up being more satisfying, the capability to do an insane number of choices. So again, I just kind of went with 6. There's a couple places in the game where 6 works really well as just kind of like a maximum count per choice. But, imagine this as a 6x6 grid. Yes, writing 36 different things you could say at a moment is absolutely insane and not sustainable, even just from a player playing through it, let alone writers writing it. It reminded me to touch on search engine features for late stage Electra, but we're definitely going to shelve that for now. 36 options, that's pretty bad. Yes, but I've freed the writer from is it a dichotomy? From the conflating choice with meaning. So the illusion of choice has been vanquished, which just means you don't need one-to-one choice to, outcome or reaction. You don't need that in order for the choice to be meaningful. So most of the time, and many games have kind of out of pure necessity and also just trying to wrangle the story, have made a lot of choices illusions. So obviously no game has a long form factor of exponential content that doesn't involve generation, because if every dialogue choice has to lead to 2 more dialogue choices eventually, you will not get that many branches deep before you're either giving the player way less choices, just in general, just kind of read the text and you're not an actor here, or they're giving you fake choices. A lot of times that can be really well done with flavor text, but sometimes it's just literally doesn't matter at all. The same exact thing occurs afterwards. And I don't want to dig into the experience is different because the player has the misunderstanding that their choices mattered, because in the moment they don't know that they didn't matter. So the idea that you can compliment a guy on his haircut, or you can say nothing, and you may easily be led to believe that the guy could have said one of 2 different things, but maybe they only will ever say whatever, which really matches you complimenting the hair, and less so the other comment. It doesn't matter. The point that I'm trying to make is it's not just about the illusion of choice being a valid experience. It actually informs the structure of what writing is possible or can be approached by writers. So if writers kind of have this, it's almost like anti-homework or constraint on them the whole time they're working on a game project story, which is basically hey, we can't branch this too many times because we're limited by art assets, and also our own writing. So if the story kind of demands the player's intentional participation, as far as like, oh, the player would really want to weigh in on this decision, but you've got this constant balancing act of, well, you better make sure that that the content needed to support that branching can be done, or else you're going to have to cut it and make the story worse, probably. But part of that pressure comes from the illusion of choice, where you're a little bit worried that you're not going to be able to make all choices actually matter. So that's reasonable. And then you're also worried about keeping up the impression, because it's really good for drama and pacing generally, for players to believe that what they're choosing matters, let alone the player experience. But it doesn't matter, because living with that constraint is going to heavily influence your writing style. And I think, most gamers are, of course, min-maxers and are much more intelligent than the developer gives them credit for, even how they would play the game with supposedly infinite game knowledge. So I think you really can feel it, even on your first playthrough, a lot of the time when a choice is fake. Sometimes just because when a choice is fake, whatever the shared written response for the AI, so like, what was it, in Doki Doki Literature Club, you can tell the first one that commits suicide that you love her or something like that, or that you'll go out with her, and she hangs herself either way. Now, if you kind of shy away because she's being like very clingy after only just starting the game, if you're kind of like this is uncomfortable, I'm not into you, then the suicide makes a lot more sense with the story, and you assume that decision you made to essentially soft reject her had huge ramifications. Now, I love playing that game, so this isn't a criticism on that game, but it is the case that if you choose the other option, then you will be in for a little bit more of a rude awakening, or like a immersion break. Not the end of the world, but it is a trade-off that I think I've escaped here. So that was a very roundabout way. How have I escaped the illusion of choice? Well, I actually have embraced having essentially resistant or counter reaction effects. So I don't need to worry about nagging the writers that use this tool to write many different, think of these as keyframes, many different AI specific reactions to this, exact thing. You just pushed the pineapple pizza for too long, and you can write the writer can write as many options or as few as they want. They do not have to write 10 ways to react based on a slightly differing relationship or the way that you expressed your concerns about what will be eaten later. And I avoid the illusion of choice because I actually tell, or the illusion of meaningful choice, because I actually immediately tell the player what's going on in sort of an abstract way inside the player's mind. So there's no illusion going on, because you'll see this little animation pop up where it's like, okay, your relationship is a 7, and you said it in a mean way, so it's like, let's just say it has a small impact. You said it in a mean way. Actually, to make it the point a little bit clearer, let's say you said it in a nice way. And they appreciate that. So their AI's emotional response to how you're handling the situation is an 8 out of 10. Very nice. But wait, what's this? And this is something that's visualized to the player. They're reacting with a 1 out of 10, even though by all rights they deserve to treat me better. They should have treated me at an 8 out of 10. So this value is stored as guilt. And I think this ends up feeling very satisfying from the tests that I've run so far, but a lot more tests to run to kind of make sure the pacing stays fast. But I'll take these 7 points of difference. So by every right, they should have given you an 8 out of 10 response to your pineapple and Pete's comment. But character development is strong, and we allow the writers to write the characters even when the math is putting pressure on them. And that should be embraced. It's not like a sad thing. This is a beautiful thing, I think, because it inspires the kind of like bizarre conflicts that happen in real life that are, you know, stranger than fiction in some ways, because they're like so confusing. They're contradictory. That's what's going on here, is I've systematized not just meaningful choice, but when a choice would at first glance appear meaningless, because no matter what, they're going to freak out about the pizza. It's still not meaningless because they will accumulate guilt if they emotionally feel like they should have been nicer about it, but they just weren't. That will tally up. So hopefully your next question is, well, what does the player do with guilt? Everyone's treating me horribly, and I don't deserve it this time. What am I going to do with all these relationships that have, I think I just have like a sideways pentagon or something like that for guilt. So yeah, my relationships bond, which is like the little heart icon that I keep using, is like a 5 out of 10, sure. But I've got like 10 out of 10 guilt. What does that do for me? Well, it applies to the end of the reaction. So guilt and frustration works on the opposite side, but we're going to focus on guilt for now. They take a long time to stack up unless there's like a special event. So if someone does something terrible to you, generally it can generate some guilt pretty quickly. But most of the time in conversation, they're really not going to be, like immediately completely mind controlled by their guilt. So let's assume that this is built up slowly over time. Even this pineapple pizza, yes, there's 7 points of difference, but it would be more like, 1% of that gets converted or something like that. But if you get a crazy high guilt, and that'll be a little bit confusing if it's completely maxed out. So let's just say it's a 6 out of 10. Then what happens with every other reaction with this person? Say they're, not happy with whatever you were saying in conversation. They're just kind of like grumbly, annoyed. If that's what's going on, and the AI's reaction is like a 2 out of 10, if the guilt is a 6 out of 10, that actually comes smacking in here and will clamp the possible reaction on the slider that is possible. So that would be all the way to here. So I'll just do this to kind of give the idea. But they wanted to react with a 2, but then they remembered they're completely racked by guilt because they've been treating you worse than they feel like they should have, and never really got around to making it up or apologizing. In fact, maxing out guilt has lots of fun effects, as you would expect in real life, where someone who's guilty, you can typically ask to do favors for you. It will relieve them of the guilt. But that's kind of it's a tradable resource, although it can also have negative effects. Let's keep it simple though. So the reaction gets jumped, and this is just the rating actually, to a 6. And then what happens is it will then snap to the closest written keyframe, which could be at a 4. And all that means, so what does that mean? For example, what if there's only one reaction that is in there? Well, you went from them jumping up to the reaction to them falling down. And that means that instead of them feeling frustrated, so normally, I'm like really pissed off by this person, I'll try to, put a smile, grin and bear it on in the situation. Normally that would generate frustration, which is kind of the opposite guilt, and frustration clamps from the other side. Very fun, which just means like if they're having a great time hanging out with you, but then they remember they're kind of frustrated with you, even if they're feeling a 10 out of a 10, if they're really, really frustrated, then it'll bump it down before it selects what they actually say. So, beautiful band-aid. Frustration and guilt have lots of fun effects, and they actually have an additional fun effect for awkwardness and tension when it comes to actual romance maneuvers. I'm trying to keep everything as like openly accessible. There's no timeline in which you progress a relationship and then you unlock like a cutscene or the ability to be like, do you want to be dating? You can approach anyone all the time with a kiss or a hug. It's just really not going to go well most of the time. Even after they like you, even if they have a crush on you, you would still have to pick a moment that is compatible. And in this case, guilt and frustration work in the opposite way. So you may have been coasting along, keeping someone's guilt towards you really high. So they're kind of treating you artificially nicer than they would have according to the relationship. But that actually converts in a situation of romance interaction. It actually converts into awkwardness, which just basically means you're less likely to get receptiveness if you're trying to like go for a kiss or a hug or ask them out. It's just like they're conflicted internally and not in like a they're into you. They're conflicted internally like okay, how much longer do I have to be nice to this person? Like this is becoming a big problem. I'm starting to worry that they're misinterpreting all of my guilt motivated positive treatment of them as me liking them. That kind of effect becomes real, and so I visualize and represent that as awkwardness. The same thing exists in the opposite way for frustration. Yes, frustration is constantly making them treat you worse than they normally would. A very fun effect, and kind of the sitcom effect of like, oh, they're only mean because they like you. Well, this is like a much more nuanced version of that. So they're treating you worse because they're very frustrated with you, but that frustration has an ice-breaking effect where it's such a subject where you're basically teasing and poking each other that you can end up in situations where you would never have considered that there was like chemistry or a romantic fling, or rather you just have such a lively debate of insulting each other or just being rude or avoiding each other going on. So stuff can happen more organically through that. So very fun. I love the guilt and frustration system. Some of my favorite things that I'm excited for players to play with. So what's next? Well, I still hadn't really solved the pacing problem. And for a really long time, I think this is really where I move from being kind of in the classic dating sim genre, sort of like a visual novel, but more like an RPG, to something I think completely different maybe. Is okay, so pacing wise, you've got your dialogue options. Sometimes there's a lot. Oftentimes, maybe there's just like, 6 or 4 or 3 or 2. But what do I do with the kind of almost like dynamic freedom demand of VR? Something that drew me to work in VR almost immediately is there's this default player freedom, which is very upsetting, but also I think very inspiring. And what I mean by that is, especially in the early days of VR, but even now as well, you can't stop players from moving through stuff or putting their hands through stuff, or like, during a cutscene, you can't make them be still. That's not how the platform works. So you kind of have to work with the player, or at least you're strongly incentivized to, if you want them to, care about any of the things you want them to care about in your game. So I just love that freedom, and I was drawn to this point over and over and over and over. Just how much freedom does the player have in the dialogue system? I had a lot of wins with frustration and guilt, so I was thinking, okay, I've got my one size fits all band-aid. Maybe I can open it up and allow the player more freedom to really do whatever they want. Now it's not just about the dialogue choices, the macro, or the sub-expressions of those dialogue choices. Micro. Maybe I also expose mega level decisions. So I always had it, and most games work this way to a large extent, as far as initiating conversations, or like you could think about side quests, like beginning them is a mega level decision as far as the way that I'm using the term in my system. A micro is an expression. Oh, actually, let me change this. All of these as decisions. So a micro decision is how to say it. So it's not the what you say, but the way you say it. That's kind of the micro vibe. Macro is what does it mean, or like what are you intending it to mean? And I think I may have skipped over it earlier, but one of the really cool things about the kind of the intersection of multiple micros, so multiple ways of expressing the same idea but with different emotional flavors, is you can look at all of those and be like, okay, what do these share in common? And that can actually be an exhaustive but emotionally nuanced way of communicating ideas to the player without it having been said straight out. So maybe in the past, if you wanted to communicate, like with traditional dialogue choice systems, if you wanted to communicate some sort of like subcontext, subtext going on, you'd have a tough time without ruining things. So maybe the secret is that there's a mole in the operation, and they've and about them, but you're kind of testing the waters a little bit. Communicating to the player in the form of the dialogue choices that they will communicate to the other characters in the story is pretty confusing. So you kind of have the choice of the player having no idea what's going on, like even as they play the player character who clearly is doing things for some reason. Either you don't have the player and understand what's going on, or you ham-fist it, and kind of the conversation, like the style, the flow is like a lot worse. You don't want to put a dialogue option, even if you intend the player not to choose it. You don't want to put a dialogue option that's like, so has there been any moles lately, or like missing documents? Have you heard anything about infiltration? Like, it's so ridiculously on the nose, but how else do you communicate ideas? Well, now you can. Now you can communicate very complicated hidden ideas. And a lot of players, and maybe most players, won't see them, but it's conceivable that you could, because of the intersection of multiple micros. So multiple ways to hint at the fact that you're trying to test the waters for whether they want to hear your insider information on a mole. So maybe the macro of it is basically you're expressing some sort of an idea about, like, has there been any behavior that would explain this being like someone infiltrating the organization. So one micro expression has been like, have you seen anything like weird at the office lately? Or has anyone been working weird? How's everyone's hours? Or like questions like that by themselves And that's by intention in real life. Sometimes we ask purposely vague and kind of veiled questions because we're trying to play the game of getting information without giving any, or rather without backing ourselves into a corner in which we must explain why we are asking certain questions. So now you get to have that as a writer, or as a player. Writers get to try to create that for players by hiding ideas. And sometimes I think it will be very intuitive. You can hide ideas not even in the words that are used, but in the structure, which is, okay, all of these things share an idea, and the sharing of an idea is literal. And that's why I've systematized meaning here. It is literal because the set of micro expressions of the same idea, so all of the micros that make up a macro, are linked to a group of reactions. So what is meaning, except for perhaps the group of corresponding reactions based on every other variable? So that was cool, and at least I think it is. And something that I had given up on in the past is the kind of chaos that ensues from mega level decisions. So, you're not just deciding what you want to say in a conversation, whether you like books or whether you like sports or both. And how to express it. You're upbeat or sad boy. You're not just doing those things, but you're also deciding whether to continue the conversation at all. So in came combination reactions. So this is kind of what stalled out the demo that I was working on for the game, because this absolutely consumed, like 4 or 5 months. And then that consumed Omniscience. And that will have to be another video because that will take some time to explain. But basically, I realized that, okay, the player does things and the AI, sorry. Let me scoot over this way. Jeez. Player does stuff and the AI reacts to it. Now, I jumped into the math, but this is expanded a little bit because, what is stuff? Stuff, it has a category, which I called the gist of it. So is it an aggressive action? That would include both punching someone as well as insulting someone in an intentionally aggressive manner. So you have the gist, or the category, and then the AI's personality matches that category. So the easy example is a pacifist. The gist of an action, maybe you get into a fight at school, could even be self-defense, but that still would contain aggression if you fight back. One AI character who's just against any kind of violence, even if you're on the receiving end, would use a reaction formula to aggression of disgust. And all that means is it will process your relationship. So it will take the bond of the relationship, and then probably it will add the tone, which is kind of a simple way to look at embedded emotions in conversation. Anyways, the AI has a set reaction formula. So disgust in this case, equals bond plus tone. Tone is the micro expression damage type. And bond is the ongoing cumulative relationship to the player. Cool. So that works. And the reason I mentioned that before combination reactions is, okay, great. Having different categories for different reaction formulas is something that I've wanted basically forever. because an idea that really consumed me from the beginning of time, even just how I think about dated cultural and the real world, as well as for like the kind of, I guess, fun strategy, skill, and just like powerfully realistic experience of, well, most people use different reaction formulas for different situations. So if you're just, chit chat in the classroom with your friends, that's going to be, and I think I have like a t-shirt icon or something like that in game for this. That's just like a slice of life, or I call it a lifestyle gist category. So for most people, the reaction formula they're going to use for that is they're going to check in with the bond, which is basically just the friendship, and they're going to add the tone. However, when it comes to romance, so I think the icon for this is lips. For romance, I think pretty much nobody would be using the, let's see, bond plus tone. Is that just the tone reaction? No one would be using that for romance because a completely different set of factors. You're not just kind of being nice for the sake of it. You're either passionately into something, sort of confused, or like very repulsed. So in that case, and this is different per AI character, just like in real life, the reaction formula they might use to romantic actions or conversation would be the respect that they have for you, and the respect formula is a little bit more involved, but basically it's respect plus their interest in you plus their impression of you in the moment. So as soon as I found a way to organize, and again, universalizing the way that the math is calculated was just very important to me with this, because I feel like it really hasn't been done. One, because it's just very impractical to have that many options and to keep that consistently. And that's why I use depth branching in order to just plainly expose to the player when there isn't any depth. And that depth isn't a failing of the game, but it's a failing of the character as intentionally written. And what I mean by that is, if you have a character that's not supposed to be seriously considering, or just sensitive to the situation's variables, like if they're always going to say the same thing, then that's how they should be written, and we shouldn't need to escape the burden of convincing players that the choices matter, because now I'm telling them when the choice kind of didn't matter, at least in the traditional sense. Great. So now all AI personalities operate on a series of reaction formulas they use to all the categories of things that exist. So I was feeling pretty good as far as like covering my bases here. I think all the different, formulas, there's like a charisma one, loyalty, pity, competition. Really fun, and it's just reformatting with pretty simple algebra the core variables. What is your respect? I think that is the charisma formula. Loyalty is friendship, which is bond, and that might be, is that minus respect? No, that's pity. Pity is they take your friendship and they subtract the amount that they respect you, and that's how pity works. And you can start to see, like, it's pretty intuitive, realistic enough, and it's something that I think players can start to intuitively act on. So I was beginning to have some more hope about pacing, but it's definitely still an issue at this point. And that's led me to my next thing. So as I mentioned, combination reactions took an incredibly long time. I was just trying to update the UI, and then, as often happens with these sorts of situations, it just clicked, and I realized that, I need to visualize these things faster, stronger, faster, with less button presses, and I needed to embrace the mega level decisions. I was paralyzed during the writing process partially because I felt compelled to do the same thing that I said that my system freed people from. What a word salad. Um, I'm telling people, I was like, oh, writers are oppressed by needing to support the, suspending disbelief, which in this case is believing that your dialogue choices matter. They're facing a lot of pressure, but I was facing a lot of pressure from, oh no, my dialogue system has been set up that you can have 36 dialogue options. And for this whole conversation, I gave the player like one or two, like, not, even close to having the game or like the early drafts of the story live up to the potential of the tool. So how did I escape that? Well, partially I just forced myself to do some actual writing, and just try to make a draft and kind of see how it felt. Um, but another part was, okay, something that will be insanely difficult, but will free me from maybe 5% writer's paralysis from time to time, which is the mega level decisions. So if I allow the player to not just do, those decisions, but decide whether to talk at all. Like they could start a conversation, they can leave, they can run out in the middle, they can do all of that. And then I was starting to realize that, well, since AIs use reaction formulas to react to dialogue or actions, so the AI uses the same processing, like, how do I feel about this? 0 to 10, rate your pain. They're going to use the same formula for dialogue. So, like, if you do something very aggressive, like, give me all your lunch money, versus something very aggressive physically, like you're punching them or hitting them in some way, those are going to be evaluated emotionally for the AI the same way. Now, what they do with it is completely set by the writer, but yeah, they'll be processed the same way. And then I realized, aha, eureka! So I have a huge pacing problem, which was basically, I want to visualize the AI's internal thought process for reacting to what you just said, and I also want every single thing the player ever says to be a choice, even if it's a limited one. It was important to me that I follow that to its fullest extent, because otherwise I will fall into some of the same traps that I was warning people are in that. And I've certainly experienced games that are dynamic where it feels like there's a serious pushback of utilizing the possibility for dynamicness. And it kind of makes sense. It's hard enough to write one story, let alone many variants of the story that combine in strange ways. But it didn't matter to me because I wanted to be free of like, oh, how am I gonna only write 1 or 2 dialogue options per exchange for the player when its max capacity is 36, or 36 6 times, depending on how you count it. How am I gonna not use even a small fraction of that? And I realized I could stop worrying and I could actually write more if I allowed mega choices to exist. If I allowed the player to just dip on stuff, even during some of the prologue stuff, like, hey, if you want to try to get out of the house before hearing anything about what you're supposed to be doing or like who you are, I think that's fun and exciting, and I want to encourage that kind of freedom. And that's, I guess, kind of, again, goes core to my being inspired by VR as a platform. There's just this aggressive experimental freedom which most games are not equipped to handle, but like it does, as a developer, like make you think about like what I'm gonna let the player do. And usually the answer is there is no let. The player just does. They walk around, they put their hands through stuff, or they like stand right in front of the characters. It's more like, well, what are you going to do about it when the players, all of them, probably immediately do all the things that like aren't compatible with how you envisioned the game being played. So yeah, so I love that. I'm very excited, and that was part of what combinations reactions was, as kind of like wasn't just a feature, it was just a reimagining of the entire structure of everything. Because the reaction formulas are shared, if the category is the same, that means if you do smack talk, like if you're threatening someone while you're fighting with them, so that's the same category, aggression and aggression, the AI can visualize the reaction to both megas. So one mega is like the fight, and another mega is like the maybe witty insults, but most of the time I think it would be something much more relevant to the moment and the story. Like they're just trying to steal from something from you that looks high value. The AI can actually process in a in a UI that the player sees. It can show their reaction to both things at once because they're going to share the same core variables of relationship, and they're going to share some of the same variables for the emotional source the player was using. Anyway, I think I'm getting way too lost in the weeds there. But anyways, I really wanted to do mega decisions, and so I have moved significantly towards that. It's a can of worms because crazy stuff is now possible where, yeah, you can be talking and fighting at the same time, and not just that they coexist, but they actually interact with each other. The emotional properties, so the emotional damage type of what you say has an influence on how the AI is reacting, not just to that thing, but any physical things that are happening to them. So, for example, if you are flirting with someone and then also trying to, I guess, kleptomaniac style, steal random stuff from their person, it's a Skyrim situation kind of, or something. The emotions of you stealing, which I guess would be like more like sneaky or timid or smart or maybe dumb, not sure, will leach in if the AI is aware of them into your other conversation, or actions and stuff like that. So hopefully I've done enough to allow things to exist in an interruptible state. Any conversation you should be able to at least try to get out of. And the only thing that I would do to block players is have characters that I think would be true to themselves and realistically attempt to block the player from escaping. Like, okay, you have two stowaways that are hiding out in your apartment, your mom's apartment with you as you go to school. They really want you to go to school to appear normal and not draw more attention. So if you attempt to not go, then as soon as they hear about it, if they're not live tracking you from the get-go, they're going to be applying lots of escalating pressure, and you can use mega decisions to say or not say anytime you want. I'm fine with that. I would love to explore literally whatever the players want to do or don't want to do, and see if I can write content for that. So that's two or three steps ahead. But once I get the demo out, I would love to allow people to send me basically where they hit a dead end, because this will be an early access project for a little while probably, where they hit a dead end writing wise, and then I can expand the story in those very specific branches. So I'm really, really excited about that. That feels like a good wrap up point. I did bait out the whole omniscience, but I can give a vague kind of understanding. So combination reactions just means the player can do lots of things at once: punching, stealing, hugging. You can try to do all those at once. It might be difficult to pull off. And the AI that is aware of all these things will combine them in how the AI reacts afterwards. Now this caused a lot of problems because of the commingling and the mega jumping. So it used to be one mega. Think of that as like an entire conversation. You used to be able to count on that as being whole and getting all the way through. But now that it's not, I had to come up with all sorts of, well, how do I deal with this situation? What if it's an important conversation to the writer? Well, then I would want to set it at an unresolved state. So basically think of it as like a quest that you sign up for in an MMO. It's just kind of actively going. And then I have a couple fun ideas planned where basically there's an expectations system where if people ask you to do stuff and you say yes, you don't have to do them, but there'll be like an expectation initially starts out as a buff, because people love when you say you'll do stuff with them or like favors for them. That's a buff. They'll treat you a little bit nicer for a bit. That will fade, and then if you don't do the thing that you said you're going to do, then that expectation will turn into frustration or some sort of a negative event in that way. Yeah. And that is some of the things that I had to bring to combination reactions to make that work properly. Of course, in many cases, the player could be doing many things that don't share the same category. So actually that would be an example of that. So if you're trying to talk to someone and then simultaneously be in a fight with someone else, unless the person who you're talking to is like in fighting gear and wants to hop in, it wouldn't overlap. And if it doesn't overlap, the AI will use different reaction formulas. And if the AI is using different reaction formulas, then it becomes harder to visualize at the same time where the ratings are going and why. So I've kind of waved the white flag on that one and basically said, okay, if it's a chain reaction dialogue series of things that you're saying, well, cool, because those are useful, but yeah. And then I think next steps right now, this has been such a huge shockwave on the whole project that I, despite having spent so much of the time, almost like probably 80 to 90% of the project, even after making so many characters and having functional demos many times, although never publicly released, just privately tested and amongst friends and family. Despite all that, the tool that I made for Electra that's on the Unity Asset Store really doesn't have the firepower to deal with this. And that's kind of where I went towards the Omniscience system. So basically, dang the influences that could be at play in any dialogue exchange or action exchange. So this, these combination reactions also exist. If you're trying to kiss a girl or a guy and, he's on the line as far as being into it or not, he's confused, doing multiple things at the same time can have a slight effect, positive or negative, on those internal calculations. So, if you put your hand on their waist while you go for the kiss, if they're into that type of thing, that could be enough to bump you up, in which case you essentially get these like cool real-time combos that are synchronized with conversation, and I'm really excited about that. I'm got a lot of kind of almost like Sherlock Holmes-esque systems at play, and I haven't even gotten into the preemptive emotion system, and preemptive, it kind of goes hand in hand with omniscience. The general idea is basically this dialogue system has a lot of choices. It's going slow. What if I could think about a simplified version of what I want to say while the other person is still talking? So the AI is, typing away in their little bubble in real time. What if the player can go ahead and scrub through the like general emotional categories? They don't really know what they're going to say, but maybe they'll say something humiliating is one of the options, or solemn. You could scrub through these options, and then you could pre-commit to saying them, which means as soon as it's your turn to talk, you're just going to fly off, and you can watch yourself talk in real time and see like, oh, so when I was feeling like, grumpy in my head and I chose the solemn option, okay, this is what that was. Can't believe I just said that to all these people. So I think that would be really fun and kind of help speed up the pace, especially if the stakes are ever low for the person that's playing it. And so, so the preemptive system got extremely messy because I couldn't accurately predict enough steps in advance with the way that the system was. So you have a conversation, just think of it as like a Facebook Messenger, back and forth. I couldn't necessarily predict what the next set of player options were, because that's dependent on the AI reacting a specific way to arrive at that point. So I developed the Omniscience system to do its best job. No, it won't always be right about what the next set of player options are. It won't always be right, but it will try, and it will be right enough where it gives you the general impression that, like, okay, this is basically what I'm sifting through in my mind, with the added bonus, okay, I'm sifting through these things in my mind, but wait, what happened? All of my preemptive, all the things I was thinking about saying next, I had a really hilarious joke I was going to tell, and now that's been taken from me. And what that will mean, if the players get to understand how preemptive emotion, they'll kind of get an intuition for it, I think, eventually. That means, oh, something that happened, either the AIs did to themselves, butterflex style, or that I did, like I changed something, and that made the difference in the conversation going a different way at this point. So I was thinking about this thing, but that was part of a future that no longer exists. So it breaks apart and you get your new options. You're like, oh wow, what happened? Like, I wonder what that timeline looks like. So it may or may not be fair for me to say, but with that specific feature, I think I've actually come up with a way for players to kind of get that literal FOMO without ruining it. Well, at least completely. It's ruined in the fact that when things could have gone differently, but you have no idea how different. It could be very topical flavor text, or it could be significantly different based on those interactions. Yeah. So I had to beef up the Omniscience system to pre-calculate the entire conversation, guessing at what the player would choose, guessing what the AIs would choose, allowing the AIs to generate their responses based on what I would guess all the potential sources of emotions going on are, and then I need to correct and recognize when the outcome is different and the player is on a totally different train track of the conversation, so that they can play an animation that shows their old dialogue option hovers, if they got into that, disappearing and being replaced with new ones, or none at all. Yeah. Super excited about that. I think I've got the way that it's going to work all mapped out at the core. It just comes down to animations and reorganizing the scripts and the writing tool so that it works within this system. One of the problems, which is why I leaned away from doing mega level decisions, which is just like utter chaos. Like, you're gonna let the player go monster hunting in the spirit world, and then they're all queued up to go, and then the player just ditches his team, and like, maybe with that kind of chaotic freedom, I let his whole team die, if that's just how it is. Allowing that to happen should encourage the kind of freedom that I want people to bring to this game. They can choose options because they think it's min-maxed for making a character feel a certain way, or they can choose options for their own benefit or to fit a specific play style. Part of why the magic system exists, or like the whole game has a story that involves magic, is that I did want to empower players to choose dialogue options that they just want to, like, whether it resonates or they're like shocked and awed by, like, oh, like, where is this gonna go? I want players to feel free to do that without constantly backtracking. Backtracking has got to be one of my least favorite parts of any game ever. I feel crazy, like a crazy person, and dumb at the same time. It's just such a waste. So there's no backtracking unless you want to manually go and reload a save. The game just kind of continues on. That's always been the design. I want the player not just to be able to, court some other character, but for them to do all this build up and end in rejection, depending on how things go, and it's just not linking up. And the player getting to decide at that point, well, okay, that was terrible and not my intended play style. I really wanted to play the play style where I was dating my best friend. And now, like, the way that the rejection system has been, from what I understand in the game, I'm saying this as a player, from what I understand, the rejection debuff is so massive, it could take like the rest of the game to get back into the good graces with this character. Like, what's the point? I'm just gonna reload a save, I guess, and choose options that they like more. Oh wait, but there is a redemption system, and it turns out that through the magic system, I get a very special type of resource, basically rejection, the origin of these special skill points for your magic levels. Some of them you can only get through basically rejection. So maybe I'll sit on this, kind of burns a little bit, but I get to do an experimental kind of new playstyle with how my magic spells are working. And, screw that character anyways, I'll go date someone else. Those kinds of interactions are just so fascinating. And I think within this game, within the structure, within Electra, this is all possible. And I think it's significantly transformatively different, that it really isn't dialogue choice. It's like dialogue strategy or emotional damage at sort of like a turn-based JRPG Pokemon style. But even that, the macro outcome of all Pokemon battles is one person beats the other person, or I guess stops playing the game. This as a scattershot kind of branching narrative structure, I think has a lot of power, and I'm very excited to see what happens as I update the new version of the tool whenever I have time, and that will have the Omniscience system in it. So not only can you write these sometimes very deep in terms of depth of how many options you give the player and the range of the relationship you can have with the characters, because the more options you have, it means the more different ways those variables could all end up. So I'm very excited to see what people do with that, and Omniscience will pre-calculate the entire conversation, so you can immediately get a sense of like, okay, someone playing it in this way with this conversation that I'm writing, if for people who want to be modders for this, that will be another kind of part of it. Like, oh wow, every time I write conversations with this character, it's just I'm always just making sassy root options, which maybe is not the worst thing. I think it's all open, and that's part of why I love Mega Decisions, is I don't have to worry about over monologuing the player with content. If they want to get out of a thing, they can. Yeah. Well, thank you for listening to my rant. If you've made it all the way through, wow, I had a lot of fun. I often am trying to organize all the ideas that I've accumulated curator style for this game, for like the way to do things. And so this has been very helpful to me to do a big spree of getting it out in almost one burst, pretty much. Yeah. And I've been having fun with the mannequins. Yeah, I've kind of used it to sort of inspire different emotional scenes, where basically I've got it on a computer monitor arm, so it's easier to kind of maneuver them. Of course, I've only got one arm, so I take turns, but I'm not really sure what I'm going to do with it, but it's kind of a fun gadget to play with. So have a good one, and hopefully if you've made it this far, you are interested enough to keep updated and be excited for the release of Double Demons, probably as an early access. Sometimes this year would be fantastic, but we'll see how that goes.